Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 6 of The Devil and the Deep Blue Me, and I am your host, Rich Bruck. And today we are diving into something that I think touches everyone's life, but doesn't get talked about honestly, very often anyway. The daily grind. Not the aspirational version where you're grinding toward your dreams, but the actual day-to-day reality of repetitive work, mundane tasks, and the slow accumulation of small efforts that may or may not add up to anything that you can point to and feel proud of. I've spent a lot of years resenting the grind, working jobs that didn't align with my creative ambitions, teaching guitar lessons to students who sometimes don't really care that they're there, or spending hours perfecting songs that never get heard by more than a handful of people. And for a long time, I treated all of that as time that was stolen from my real work, as obstacles between me and the life I thought I was supposed to be living. But somewhere along the way, and I can't pinpoint exactly when, but I started to realize that resenting the grind wasn't making it go away. It was just making me miserable while I was doing it. And worse, it was preventing me from seeing what the grind was actually teaching me, what it was building in me that I couldn't have developed any other way. So today we're going to talk about making peace with the repetitive, unglamorous, often invisible work that makes up most of anyone's life. Not in a toxic positivity way where we pretend everything is wonderful, but in a practical way where we acknowledge that the grind is inevitable and explore how to find meaning and growth, and hey, even some occasional joy within it. Because here's what I've learned. You can spend your whole life waiting for the grind to end so that your real life can begin, or you can figure out how to live fully within the grind itself. And the second option, while it obviously requires a fundamental shift in how you think about work and meaning, is ultimately much, much more sustainable and a lot more satisfying. I've been thinking about this topic because I was talking to a friend recently who's in one of those career transition phases. You know, they know they want something different from what they're currently doing, but they haven't figured out what that something is yet. And in the meantime, well, they still have to show up to the job that's paying the bills for them. And they were expressing this frustration that I recognized pretty much immediately. I feel like I'm just going through the motions. I'm wasting time that I should be spending figuring out my real path. Every day I stay in the job is a day I'm not moving toward where I actually want to be. And I knew exactly what they meant because I have felt that way so many times. That sense that your current reality is just a holding pattern, that your real life is somewhere else waiting for you to figure out how to get there. And meanwhile, you're stuck doing work that feels meaningless and repetitive and completely disconnected from who you think you really are. I spent years feeling this way about teaching guitar lessons. Don't get me wrong, I was grateful for the income and I genuinely cared about most of my students, but in my head, teaching was what I did to support my real work as a songwriter. The lessons were just a means to an end, a time I was trading for the freedom to work on music that mattered to me. And that attitude created this low-level resentment that colored everything. I'd be in the middle of a lesson helping someone with a chord they'd been struggling with, and part of my mind would be elsewhere, thinking about a song I wanted to finish or a recording project I was planning. The creative work that felt more important than what I was actually doing in the moment. But resentment is exhausting. It takes so much energy to maintain that internal narrative about how your current reality is somehow beneath you and how you're better than your work that you're actually doing. And it prevents you from being fully present for whatever is happening right now, which means you miss opportunities for learning and connection and even moments of genuine satisfaction. And our culture doesn't really help with this. We're constantly bombarded with messages about following your passion, finding your purpose, optimizing your life for maximum fulfillment, which are great ideas, but they can also create this underlying assumption that if you're doing work that doesn't feel immediately meaningful or personally fulfilling, you're somehow failing at life. And then there's the whole hustle mythology. The idea that if you're grinding, it should be towards something specific and achievable, something that you can measure and celebrate. The grind is supposed to be temporary, a necessary phase on your way to success or recognition or whatever your particular version of making it looks like. But the reality check is that most of life is a grind. Even when you're doing the work that you love, even when you have achieved whatever success looks like in your field, there's still a lot of repetitive, unglamorous work involved. There are still administrative tasks and maintenance activities and routine responsibilities that don't really feel particularly meaningful or creative. I think the turning point for me came when I realized that waiting for the grind to end so that my real life could begin was actually preventing me from living. I was spending so much energy resisting my current reality that I wasn't available for the experiences, the lessons, and even moments of joy that were available within that reality. So I started this little experiment. What if I stopped treating my daily work as an obstacle to overcome and started treating it as a form of practice? What if instead of enduring the repetitive parts of my life, I got curious about what they might be teaching me? And something interesting happened. The work didn't change, but my relationship to it did, and I started noticing things I'd been missing when I was too busy resenting the situation to pay attention to what was actually happening. Let's start with acknowledging why the grind feels so overwhelming and why it can seem like this endless treadmill that's keeping you from whatever more meaningful life you're supposed to be living. Well, first there's the sheer repetitiveness of it. Whether you're teaching the same guitar chords to different students or answering similar customer service questions or doing administrative tasks that need to be repeated weekly or monthly or even just maintaining the basic requirements of adult life, paying bills, grocery shopping, cleaning. So much of daily existence involves doing the exact same things over and over again. And a lot of this work is invisible. Nobody's going to congratulate you for paying your electric bill on time or for patiently explaining the same musical concept to your 15th student of the week. Most grind work doesn't come with obvious markers of progress or achievement. You do it, it needs to be done again, and you do it again. I think about all the hours I've spent tuning guitars, my own, my students', instruments at venues before gigs. It's necessary work, but it's not creative work. Nobody ever says, wow, you really tuned the hell out of that guitar. But without that routine maintenance, nothing else works properly. There's also the reality that most grind work is driven by necessity rather than choice. You teach lessons because you need the income, not because you wake up every morning excited about it explaining the finger positioning for the 100th time. You take the job because it pays consistently, even if it doesn't align with your long-term goals. And that creates this constant background anxiety about opportunity cost. Every hour you spend doing work that feels routine or meaningless, it's an hour you're not spending on the creative projects, the relationship building, or the personal development that you think would move you closer to the life you actually want. Our productivity-obsessed culture makes this far worse by suggesting that every moment should be optimized, that time not spent moving toward clear goals is somehow wasted time. And social media shows us everyone else's highlights while they're stuck in the mundane details of daily maintenance. You see other people's creative breakthroughs, their career advancements, and life victories while you're grading student exercises or processing invoices or doing whatever routine work is keeping your life functioning. And it's easy to start feeling like you're falling behind, like everyone else figured out how to skip the boring parts while you're still stuck in them. There's also the simple fact that repetitive work can be mentally and emotionally draining, even when it's not physically demanding. Decision fatigue, the cognitive load of staying focused on tasks that don't naturally engage your interest. the social energy required to be pleasant and professional when you'd rather be somewhere else. All of that accumulates. And underneath all of this is what I think is the deeper issue: the modern meaning crisis. We've been told that work should be fulfilling, that we should find our purpose and follow our passion, that a meaningful life is one where you love what you do for a living. But that sets up an impossible standard. Even the most fulfilling work involves routine, maintenance, administrative tasks that aren't inherently meaningful. And when your daily reality doesn't match the inspirational narratives about following your dreams, it's easy to conclude that you're doing something wrong. And what I've learned, though, is that a lot of the suffering around the grind isn't actually caused by the work itself. It's caused by our resistance to the work, our insistence that it shouldn't be necessary, and our resentment about having to do it all in the first place. There's that Buddhist saying, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And I think that very much applies here. The grind might be inevitable, but the suffering that we create around it, the resentment, the sense of time being wasted, the constant mental commentary about how this isn't where we're supposed to be, well, that's optional. So how do we reframe our relationship to the grind? How do we shift from enduring it to finding value within it without falling into toxic positivity or convincing ourselves that everything is wonderful when it's certainly not? For me, the most helpful reframe has been thinking of grind work as practice, not practice for something specific necessarily, but practice in the fundamental skills of being human: patience, attention, consistency, showing up even when you don't feel like it. When you're learning an instrument, you don't just play the fun, exciting pieces. You practice scales and exercises and basic techniques that aren't inherently interesting, but they build the foundation that makes everything else possible. And the grind is like that, exactly. It's building capacities in you that you might not even recognize until you need them. Teaching guitar, for example, wasn't just about the income. It was developing my ability to communicate complex ideas simply, to read what someone else's needs are in the moment, and to maintain patience when progress is slow, or to find different ways to explain the same concept until it clicks for someone. And those skills transfer to everything else. The patience I developed explaining chord transitions to frustrated students helps me when I'm working through a difficult passage in my own songwriting. The observational skills I developed watching students struggle with specific techniques help me identify what's not working in my own creative process. There's also something to be said for how grind work develops character in ways that more exciting work might not. When you're doing something because it needs to be done rather than because you find it naturally compelling, you're developing your capacity for discipline and commitment and follow-through. Grind work can also be a form of mindfulness practice, if you let it. When you're doing something routine that doesn't require your full creative attention, you have the opportunity to notice what's happening in your mind, to observe your reactions and patterns without being caught up in them. Like washing dishes, which I used to hate because it felt like time I could be spending on doing something else. But when I started treating it as a kind of a meditation time, as an opportunity to be present with simple, immediate tasks, it became almost restful. Not exciting by any means, but grounding in a way that balanced out the more chaotic aspects of life. Another helpful reframe is thinking about how grind work serves something larger than yourself. Even when individual tasks feel meaningless, they're often part of systems that help other people or contribute to something worthwhile. Those guitar lessons I sometimes resented, they were helping people connect with music, giving them skills they could use for stress relief or creative expression or social connection. The administrative work that felt tedious was part of maintaining systems that allowed creative work to happen. And this doesn't mean that you have to feel grateful for every moment of tedious work. That would be fake and unsustainable, but it can help to occasionally consider the ways that routine work is supporting the life you want to live, even when it doesn't feel immediately meaningful. I've also found it very helpful to think of grind work as seasonal rather than permanent. Even when you're in a phase where most of your time is spent on routine tasks, that doesn't mean that it's your permanent reality. It's just the current season, and seasons change. And sometimes the grind can actually inform and improve your creative work. The observations you make about human nature while teaching, or the problem-solving skills you develop dealing with routine challenges, or the empathy that you build through service work, all of that can feed back into your art in very unexpected ways. So what have I actually learned from making peace with the grind? What concrete insights have emerged from years of trying to find meaning and value within the repetitive, unglamorous parts of life? Well, first and most importantly, the grind isn't a punishment or an obstacle. It's a teacher. But like any teacher, it only works if you show up with the right attitude. If you're consistently fighting it, resenting it, treating it as time stolen from your real life, well, then you're not available for whatever lessons that it might have to offer. One of the biggest things grind work has taught me is patience. Not just the ability to wait for things, but active patience. The capacity to stay present and engaged with slow processes, to find satisfaction in gradual progress rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Working with, beginner guitar students taught me this in a way that nothing else really could have. When someone is struggling to make a clean chord change, you can't rush them. You can't will them to get it faster. You have to find ways to stay encouraging and helpful while they work through their own process at their own pace. And that patience has been invaluable in my own work. Songs don't emerge on your timeline. They develop at their own pace through their own process. The patience I learned teaching has helped me trust the process instead of forcing outcomes. Grind work has also developed my attention to small details, to the mundane elements that make bigger things possible. When you're tuning guitars day after day, you develop an ear for subtle variations in pitch. And when you're explaining the same technical concepts repeatedly, you notice which small adjustments make the biggest difference. And I've learned to appreciate systems and maintenance in ways I never did when I was only focused on creative outcomes. Understanding how the routine work supports the exceptional work, or how daily practices create the conditions for breakthrough moments. Like my practice of organizing my teaching materials at the end of the day. It seemed very trivial at the time, but it meant that each lesson could start smoothly instead of me scrambling to find the right music or equipment or whatever. And those small systems created space for better teaching and more presence with the students. The grind has built resilience in me, not just the ability to endure difficult circumstances, but the capacity to find stability and even satisfaction within uncertainty and routine. When you're comfortable with the mundane, you're less dependent on external excitement or validation to feel okay about your life. I've learned that consistency often matters more than inspiration. Showing up regularly to routine work or maintaining daily practices even when you don't feel like it, building habits that support your long-term goals, that's often way more valuable than waiting for moments of perfect motivation. And counterintuitively, some of my best creative insights have come during routine work. When your conscious mind is occupied with simple, familiar tasks, your subconscious has space to work on more complex problems. And I've solved songwriting challenges while washing dishes, or figured out, a way I'm going to show little Johnny the G chord while driving to lessons themselves. Grind work has also connected me to communities I wouldn't have encountered otherwise. Teachers and dealing with similar challenges, or students working through their own learning processes. The shared experience of showing up to work that isn't always immediately rewarding. And I guess maybe most importantly, making peace with the grind has helped me redefine success. Instead of measuring my life only by creative achievements or external recognition, I've learned to value the capacity to show up consistently, to find meaning and service to others, and to maintain equanimity during routine work. And I've seen how all of those small routine efforts compound over time in ways that aren't always visible in the moment. The teaching skills, the patience, the attention to detail, the resilience, all of that has supported my creative work and personal growth in ways I could never have anticipated. And here's the paradox that I've discovered. Making peace with the grind actually creates more freedom, not less. When you stop fighting the routine parts of life, when you develop genuine skill at finding satisfaction within necessary work, you're less dependent on external circumstances to feel fulfilled. You can find meaning and even joy almost anywhere. Let me tell you about a little period in my life that completely changed how I think about the value of routine work. I was feeling stuck in my teaching routine, questioning whether I was wasting my time on work that didn't feel particularly meaningful or creative. And then I got this new student, and we will call him David. He was in his 60s, recently retired, and he'd always wanted to learn guitar, but had convinced himself he was too old to start. He was incredibly nervous during his first lesson, apologizing for his clumsy fingers and warning me that he might be a hopeless case. And David struggled with everything. Basic chord shapes that most people pick up in a few weeks took him months to master. His fingers weren't used to the precise movements required, and he got frustrated easily. There were lessons where he'd show up and say, "I practiced all week, but I still can't get this. Maybe I should just quit." And I'll be honest, at first, I found his slow progress a little frustrating, not because I didn't care about him, but because I was still measuring success by obvious, rapid advancement. I wanted him to have breakthrough moments, clear progress markers that I could point to as evidence that the lessons were worthwhile. But gradually, I realized that my impatience was getting in the way of being helpful. So I started focusing on much smaller increments of progress. Instead of expecting him to master entire songs, I celebrated when he could make one chord change cleanly. And instead of pushing for speed, I emphasized accuracy and comfort. And something very interesting happened. As I slowed down my expectations and started paying closer attention to tiny improvements, I began to notice things about learning and teaching that I'd completely missed when I was focused on bigger, more obvious outcomes. I noticed how David's face changed when he finally made a chord ring clearly. Not dramatic celebration, but this quiet satisfaction that was actually more moving than the excitement of students who picked up things quickly. And I learned to recognize the moment when a physical movement shifted from conscious effort to muscle memory. I developed an appreciation for the patience and the courage that it takes to keep practicing something that you find difficult. David ended up taking lessons with me for 3 years. He never became what anyone would call an advanced player, but he developed enough skill to play simple songs that really meant something to him. Old folk songs that his father used to sing. Basic accompaniments to songs that he'd learned in church as a kid. And working with him taught me more about teaching and patience and the value of small, consistent efforts than any of my more successful students ever had. It showed me that my job wasn't to transfer technical knowledge. It was to help people connect with something they cared about, regardless of how quickly or extensively they progressed. But the bigger lesson was about my own relationship to routine work. David's willingness to show up week after week, to practice exercises that weren't immediately rewarding, to find satisfaction in tiny improvements, well, that taught me something about how to approach the grind in my own life. And I started applying the same principles to my own practice, to administrative work, even to household tasks. Instead of measuring everything by dramatic outcomes, I started noticing small improvements and celebrating consistency and finding satisfaction in showing up regardless of how I felt or what results I could see. And that shift affected everything. My own music practice became more sustainable because I wasn't constantly judging it against impossible standards. My teaching improved because I was more present with each student instead of always focused on the progress metrics. Even mundane tasks became more tolerable because I wasn't constantly resenting them. David moved away a few years ago, and I still think about him whenever I'm feeling frustrated with slow progress or routine work. He showed me that the grind isn't just something you endure while waiting for better circumstances. It's where real learning happens, where character develops, and where you discover what you're actually capable of when you stop demanding that everything be immediately rewarding. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this reflection on making peace with the daily grind. First, peace isn't found by escaping the grind. It's found by changing your relationship to it. As long as you're treating routine work as an obstacle to your real life, or as time stolen from what you'd rather be doing, you're going to be miserable, regardless of what work you're actually doing. Try reframing grind work as practice rather than punishment. Every routine task is developing skills you might not even recognize. Patience, consistency, attention to detail, the ability to find satisfaction in small improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. And treat the grind as a teacher, not an enemy. But like any teacher, it only works if you show up with the right attitude. If you're constantly fighting it, you're not available for whatever lessons it has to offer. The quality of your attention matters more than the nature of the work. You can find meaning, growth, and even moments of satisfaction in almost any task if you're genuinely present for it instead of mentally somewhere else. Small, consistent efforts compound over time in ways you might not recognize immediately. The skills you develop through routine work, patience, reliability, attention to systems, they often support your creative and your personal goals in very unexpected ways. And finally, making peace with necessary work actually creates more freedom, not less. When you're not constantly resisting your current circumstances, and when you can find satisfaction in routine tasks, you're less dependent on external conditions to feel fulfilled. So, the next time you're facing work that feels tedious or meaningless, try asking, what might this be teaching me? Or how might this be developing capacities I'll need later on? Or what small satisfactions can I find within the task? Not because you should pretend to love every moment of routine work. That would be horribly fake, but because finding ways to be present and engaged with necessary tasks makes your whole life just more livable, more meaningful, and ultimately more satisfying. The grind isn't keeping you from your real life. It is your real life, at least a significant part of it. And learning to live fully within it instead of constantly wishing you were somewhere else might be one of the most important skills that you can ever develop. So now it's time for this week's EnRICHment segment, where we explore some fascinating facts that might change how you think about routine work and repetitive tasks. Did you know that the Japanese master sushi chefs spend years and sometimes decades just learning to properly prepare rice before they're allowed to touch fish? The rice preparation involves hundreds of tiny adjustments in temperature, timing, and seasoning that can only be mastered through repetitive practice. Wow. So, what really strikes me about this is how they've elevated routine work to an art form. The repetition isn't seen as drudgery to get through before the real work begins. The repetition is the real work. The mastery comes from finding infinite subtlety within apparently simple tasks. It's pretty cool. So here's another one. Research on habit formation shows that people who approach routine tasks with what psychologists call implementation intentions, specific mental frameworks about when, where, and how they'll complete tasks, report significantly higher satisfaction and lower stress levels than people who just endure the exact same work. And that certainly resonates with me because it suggests that the meaning we find in routine work isn't just about the work itself, it's about how we frame our relationship to it. The same task can be tedious, drudgery, or mindful practice, depending on the mental context that we create around it. And finally, studies of long-term life satisfaction show that people who develop what researchers call adaptive capacity, the ability to find meaning and engagement within whatever circumstances they find themselves in, consistently report higher happiness levels than people who focus primarily on changing their external conditions. So, in other words, the skill of making peace with routine work, of finding satisfaction within necessary tasks, isn't just about work It's about life. It's about developing the capacity to be fully present wherever you are, doing whatever needs to be done, instead of always waiting for better circumstances to start living. So then, from master sushi chefs to habit research or to satisfaction studies, the evidence all seems to point to the same truth. How you approach routine work matters more than what the work actually is. The grind isn't the enemy of meaningful life. Resistance to the grind is. And then, just as a quick little music update, I've been working on this piece that started as a simple little finger picking exercise, which I've mentioned. But instead of just running through the exercises mechanically, I started really listening to the subtle variations that emerged as my fingers found their own rhythm within the patterns. And what I discovered was all these tiny hesitations, slight emphasis, and micro timing variations that were all creating their own kind of musical interest. The routine practice was actually generating something unique, but only because I was paying close attention instead of just going through the motions. So I started building this song around these little textures, layering in harmonies and rhythmic elements that only reveal themselves when you actually listen pretty carefully. And it's become this piece about finding complexity within simplicity, about how routine work can contain its own form of beauty if you're just, present enough to notice it. It's a perfect metaphor for what I've been talking about today. The foundational work, the repetitive practice, the stuff that seems boring on the surface, that's often where the most interesting discoveries happen. But only if you approach it with attention and curiosity rather than just endurance. If you would like to follow along with any of these little musical experiments or anything I have completed thus far, you can always find links to my Spotify or Apple or anywhere that you like to stream your music from up in the description. And if you're watching this on YouTube now, please subscribe and catch these little explorations as well as this podcast. And just support indie talent as much as you can, because it's helpful to the little guy. This beautiful thing about music is that it teaches you to find infinite variety within simple structures. And maybe that's what's making peace with the grind is really all about. Learning to hear the music in the routine, the subtle variations that make repetition interesting rather than mind-numbing. So that's episode 6, friends, a deep dive into making peace with the grind, finding meaning within routine work, and discovering that the quality of your attention matters far more than the nature of your tasks. Thank you very much for joining me this week. And here's what I would like to hear from you. What work in your life have you been resenting? And what might change if you approached it as a practice instead of a punishment? Household maintenance, administrative tasks, some aspect of creative practice. I don't know, something that feels tedious but necessary. Try this experiment for a week. Pick one routine task and approach it with genuine curiosity. What skills might it be developing? And what can you notice if you pay closer attention? And what small satisfactions might be available within the work itself? If you're feeling stuck in routine work that doesn't feel meaningful, remember that meaning isn't just about what you're doing, it's about how you're doing it. The same task can be soul-crushing drudgery or mindful practice, depending on the attention and the intention that you bring to it. And remember that the grind isn't separate from your real life. It is your real life, or at least a significant part of it. Learning to live fully within necessary work instead of constantly waiting for better circumstances might be one of the most practical skills you can ever develop. The goal isn't to love every moment of routine work. That would be unrealistic. The goal is to stop fighting it so hard that you miss whatever value it might actually contain, whatever skills it might be developing, and whatever small satisfactions might be available if you're present enough to notice them. So make peace with your grind. Find the music in your routine and keep showing up with attention instead of just endurance. Sometimes the most profound discoveries happen in the most ordinary moments, but only if you're awake enough to notice them. And of course, while you continue to practice the art of being present with whatever needs to be done, please have yourself a safe and happy week.